Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Birch. I'm with the E-Extension Network Literacy Community of Practice, and I'm talking to you from North Dakota State University today, where I work with North Dakota State University Extension Service. And this is a critical conversation on cooperative extension work and collective action networks, and really networks in general. And the way this conversation came about, of course, as someone involved in the network literacy community of practice, I've been interested in how extension can leverage networks to improve teaching and learning, but more recently, actually since my colleague Steve Judd introduced me to a book called Connecting to Change the World, sorry, little freeze up there late in the day. A book called Connecting to Change the World by Peter Piestrak and Madeline Taylor and John Cleveland. I've been more interested in how extension might be involved in what are called collective action networks, or some people call collective action networks, networks that actually do something and change communities and make an impact, a broad impact. And I had a great opportunity to connect with all of these folks. Jeff Piestrak from Cornell University has been involved in the network literacy COP for quite some time. Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And then our other panel members are Jamie Bain, Noelle, Harden, and Stephanie Heim from the University of Minnesota Extension. And I found out about them through a great report that they wrote called Cultivating Collective Action, talking about how their work with food networks in Minnesota. So just so everybody can connect faces with voices, Jamie, thanks for joining us, and Noelle.
Hi, good to be here.
And Stephanie, thank you for being part of this conversation.
Thanks for facilitating it.
All right, so viewers, as you're on here and enjoying the stream and the conversation, I hope you'll join in with us. If you have a Google account and you're connecting through YouTube or Google Plus, you can use the Q&A app inside of the Hangout. And ask your question there, and I will see it and share it with our panel. If you want to share your questions on Twitter, go ahead and do that and use the hashtag EXTCAN, so EXT Extension Collective Action Networks, or EXTCAN. If you want to use the network literacy hashtag as well, that's hashtag NetLit. I'll be monitoring both of those for questions throughout our conversation. So that's all the housekeeping that I have to do. So let's get into the conversation and talk a little bit about collective action networks, or networks in general, however you want to do it. And I think it'd be great if we could just start talking about each of our experiences with that as extension professionals. And Jamie, in the Hangout, you're on my far left, and you seem distracted. And so whenever you seem distracted, I'm going to pick on you, by the way, just so you know that. So I'm going to start with you, Jamie. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the networks that you've been involved in and your work as an extension professional within those networks?
Yeah. Distracted I am not. I was organizing the papers that I could reference for this exact question. I coordinate a large regional network in the metro here in Minnesota, so the Twin Cities metro with Minneapolis, St. Paul, and 7 counties. We're called the Metro Food Access Network, or MFAN. We have over 160 organizational partners. We meet on a quarterly basis to do the network thing. We learn from each other, share resources, build on likely connections, and then we also focus on collective action. And the action teams from those networks meet on a more regular basis. So as coordinator of the network, I do it all. I do evaluation of the network, I facilitate, I help lead the leadership team, I do all the strategic planning, from getting healthy local foods to the meetings to evaluating the process and impact, that's where I come into play.
Noelle, I'm going to go to you next, even though you're not in the left to right order that I talked about, but so we can kind of go down this path with the three of you who are at U of M Extension. So can you talk a little bit about your involvement in networks with your extension work?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Similar to Jamie, I work with networks that organize around the issue of food, particularly food systems and improving access to healthy food in Minnesota. I'm in the northwest region of Minnesota, which is much more rural than the Twin Cities area, although we do get to boast the Fargo-Moorhead metro area in our region. And there are several networks that are active in my area working at the local level around food systems change and food policy work. I have been involved at varying degrees with many of those networks, and I've also worked regionally to bring together networks and encourage collaboration across communities in Northwest Minnesota working on food systems.
And Stephanie?
Yeah, so my position is a statewide position, although I'm coming to you from Rochester, Minnesota today, which is in the southeast corner of the state. And so I've always had, I would say, a statewide perspective to my work. And so most recently, I've been involved in the development of a statewide food network, which we're calling in Minnesota the Minnesota Food Charter Network. And it exists to sort of foster and support shared action at a statewide level. And the guiding document that we use is our Minnesota Food Charter, which includes 99 policy and systems change strategies to improve access to safe, affordable, and healthy food. So my role has really been statewide, and you know, sort of leading up to sort of even the development of the Minnesota Food Charter. I had a statewide position where I was working with Jamie and Noelle and our colleagues across the state really closely to support sort of strengthening and fostering more local and regional networks across our state. And so I have that perspective. And then I also, for the last 5 years, I've coordinated Minnesota's Farm to School leadership team. So in some ways, you can say that that's a network. It's a smaller group. There's 11 organizations that come to the table 6 times a year to really make sure that we're maximizing each other's resources and minimizing duplication and leveraging each other's collective capacity. So that's sort of my hands-on, really hands-on with Farm to School, and then larger with the Food Charter Network.
And Jeff, out in New York State, what's been your involvement with networks in your extension work?
Well, the first thing I should say is a lot of my work with Extension is support. So I work at Mann Library at Cornell, and because we serve the state side of Cornell, we support Cooperative Extension in its work. And so my work at Cornell with them is supporting various program work teams who are interested in getting the information that they need to do their work. It's largely around agriculture and food systems that I do my support. So I sort of bring the tools and the resources that I have within the library world, which is also moving to a much more networked way of operating, that we can't possibly have all of the materials and resources that one would need at our institution. So we've been networking ourselves for quite a while. And in many ways, I'm working with Extension to do the same, to help them work in a more networked way. And what I'm finding is that a lot of folks here in New York State are very receptive to that because they're working with very limited resources. And a lot of our offices are working from much more of a regional approach now, where they're sharing expertise and resources across the region. So there's been a bit of a convergence. But I also do a lot of food systems work in addition to the work at the library, and a lot of that is with NGOs and groups that involve extension educators. So I find that those worlds are really bleeding into each other much more, that we all wear a lot of different hats. And again, I bring a lot of the perspectives that I have from a library world of how do we become more aware of who's doing what where. And I find within the food systems world that we're sort of tripping over each other a lot, that we're not working and truly in a networked way where we're actually moving beyond simple awareness to collaborating. So one of the groups that I work with is the Northeast Sustainable Ag Working Group, and they're sort of a network of networks in the Northeast. It's 12 states, about 500 organizations, and 4,000 to 5,000 individuals. And Extension is well represented in that network. And I just wrapped up a pilot project, which was about 4 years in the making, and we've networked 4 organizational websites together. So anytime new resources come into one of those organizations, or new people or events, we can all catalog them and share them across the information network. And I'll be giving a webinar more on that sometime this spring. So a lot of my work is sort of building the infrastructure to support networks.
So let's talk about that a little bit. We were talking just before we started the broadcast about what's different about it. Are there ways that we can express that? And I've heard a lot of that. In everybody's comments, Stephanie talked about maximizing capacity and how a network can do that. I'll go back to Jamie and say, Jamie, how can we talk about this to sort of distinguish working with a network or within a network from just working with our community, right? As an extension agent, I might say, hey, I'm involved in my community. I'm networking all the time, and I guess maybe that's true. But how might this be a different approach than what we sort of traditionally have thought of as extension work?
Yeah, I think there's kind of 2 questions in there. So
I do that a lot. There's probably 4 or 5 questions in there. I apologize.
So I can actually speak from my perspective because I come from more of the traditional extension educator model. I was managing our SNAP Ed program in the metro region, and one of our colleagues moved back to her home state, and she was facilitating and coordinating MFAN, and it dropped into my lap. And I was not on the network train at that point. I thought it was a lot of process and not too much action, and didn't really see, you do a 6-week series of classes, and you see the immediate impact, and you have that immediate reward. I didn't see that with networks until I started really being able to learn from these brilliant people that live and breathe this work, that are interconnected throughout the region, and started seeing the power in thinking like a network rather than thinking like an organization, or thinking in the big picture rather than thinking about the small picture, or thinking like in a systems approach rather than thinking about just direct education. So I think in my experience, moving from that more traditional extension educator to this sort of new extension educator model, it's been a big learning curve, but it's been so much fun, and I think that there's a lot to be learned. There's a lot of scholarly work here, and I think that as extension educators, there's a role for us to play with networks across the nation.
Anyone else want to jump in that? Stephanie?
Pick up on, so Jamie was talking about sort of thinking like a network, and there's this reference that we've used in our work out of the Institute for Social Interaction. I almost got that right, out of Boston, and Curtis Ogden. I know I didn't, but he has sort of this document around thinking like a network, and I think if you think about it, it kind of blows you away, because you're no longer thinking in an organizational way, but you are thinking about moving from the core to the periphery, and you're thinking about adaptability instead of control, and contribution before credentials. And these are different ways of working, I think, as Jamie said, that are maybe sometimes outside of the traditional extension model, and that has been a really big, I think, learning curve for all of us. And this work, for me, as I've sort of immersed myself in it, I realize it's incredibly developmental. And so I'm constantly learning myself, and the work is, you referenced the book, Bob, the Connecting to Change the World. And it's funny, Jamie and I both held it up because we keep it, close to us. But it is that idea of emergence in generative networks, and that we need to kind of continue to adapt. And I think the systems thinking piece of it all too is that, when you have these really complex social issues like healthy food access, which is the lens that we bring to our work, there's a recognition that there's no one organization that can tackle this issue alone. Extension will never be able to tackle the issue alone, and it's only with partnerships and through collaboratives and living in a networked system that will actually make change.
I'm glad you brought that up, Stephanie, because this whole idea of the big issues, wicked problems, and Nate Meyer from University of Minnesota Extension has done a great job of explaining that in some areas where we've worked together to really explain why networks work so well on these complex problems, and the idea of that complex problems like we're talking about in food systems, or childhood obesity or infant mortality. There's so many things at play that as soon as you sort of take one tack at it, address one issue, the environment's changed, and now you have to change tactics again, and the nimbleness of a network in doing that as opposed to an organization. First, I'll give anybody a chance to agree, disagree, add on to that, and then does anybody have sort of instances where that has really become apparent about how nimble the network can be?
Well, one area that, sorry, Jeff, I'll take a first stab at this. One area that I think about is policy work, and what an incredible impact that policy has on food systems and the kinds of healthy foods that we do or do not have access to. And I think that policy is a really clear area where different organizations or even different individuals within an organization are able to take on very different roles. And often our partners that we work with in healthy food access are limited in their ability to engage in certain aspects of policy work. But by partnering with other organizations, nonprofits, or individuals or community members that are able to more freely engage in that kind of work, while those of us who play more of an educational role can also support the work in that way, we're able to strengthen the kinds of things that we are able to do together and have a deeper impact on things that really have a big influence on our food system.
Jeff, you were going to jump in there.
Sure. I was going to refer to a few things that have brought me to the power of networked thinking and acting. And I've sort of been doing that out loud through some of the programming that I've done over the last decade here at Cornell, and I've invited people in to talk about the work that they do, and people like David Weinberger, Too Big to Know, Rethinking Knowledge, Now That the Facts Aren't the Facts, Experts Are Everywhere, and the Smartest Person in the Room is the Room. That's the title of a book of his. And I brought him here to Cornell just to talk about what that means and how we really can't tackle these complex challenges with individual experts, individual institutions even, like Cornell, that we need to create smart networks to tackle those. And there's also an engagement and community capacity building element to this as well, that we need people who are living those problems day to day to be a part of the solution as well, not only because they have important insights, but they have to feel like that they have some capacity to make a change in their life. And folks like Brendan Nyan are talking about motivated reasoning as a sort of resistance to facts. You know, that we can't just go into a community and say, well, these are the facts, because they might dig in their heels even more, and this sort of explains the current politics. You know, everybody's sort of moving to their polls and getting more dug in. And I really think that extension can be that middle ground, much like libraries, that sort of neutral space where meaning gets made, where knowledge gets created in the communities that we serve. And sort of one other thing that's brought me to this is the community capitals framework, that social capital is an important part of a community's problem-solving capacity as well. And really a networked approach sort of is the way to resolve all of these issues.
Well, we do have a comment and a question from a listener. Susan, I'm gonna try your last name. Probably some folks at U of M can correct me, because it sounds like she might have some connections there. Susan DeBlayek, I think it is. Says it's great to see the community food system team going strong. She's a past team member. But she does have a question. She says, Extension is organized on the state, regional, and county level. To build networks, is it especially helpful to have regional extension staff? And I think that's really interesting. U of M is more of a regional model. Here in North Dakota, we are very much a county-based model. And I can see all kinds of sort of interesting questions around what might be more effective. We have people here in North Dakota who maybe are more closely engaged in local communities, but then there is also maybe a geographic limitation on who they get connected to and how they build these broad networks. Thoughts on Susan's question about regional staff? Is it helpful?
Susan, I will be brief, and then I'll let Noelle and Jamie go because they work regionally, but big hug to you. I actually, this is one of the reasons why I stay in Extension, and why I feel so honored to be a part of Extension is I don't know of many other organizations across our country that have a local, regional, state, and national infrastructure like Extension. And I feel like that potential keeps me going in Extension. It keeps me energized, and I do think our regional, we do in Minnesota have a local, regional, and statewide structure, and I do feel like we've been able to leverage it, and we've seen the power in being able to do that. And Noelle talked about that in the beginning of her opening comments, that part of her role is not necessarily leading each of the local policy councils that are existing in the Northwest, but helping them network together to learn regionally. So I'll be quiet and let Noelle or Jamie chime in, because they work in that perspective or that scale.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. I've definitely found that I can be more of a resource and an asset to the local networks that I work with if I focus on connecting them with other things happening within our region and across the state. And rather than seeing myself as the expert or an educator, I really see myself as more of a network weaver. And by bringing together, the people doing the work on the ground and leading these initiatives, they benefit greatly from making those connections and seeing one another's projects in action as well, which is an area that we would like to explore more over this next year as we have the opportunity to have support at the state level going to building these connections between networks.
Yeah, I say ditto. I think the scaffolding effect is massive. Stephanie said thinking like a network. I just got off of our first call with the strategic team for the Minnesota Food Charter Network, and we were talking about our responsibility is to really facilitate that across the entire state, to start thinking like a network rather than an organization. And then our role as a statewide organization, because of that scaffolding effect, is that we get to think like a movement. And we have that foundation and that support and that strong web underneath us of networks from all scales that can help us really facilitate a movement across the state.
Can you talk about that a little bit more, Jamie? What do you mean by thinking like a movement? And how's that different than network?
Well, I've had about 30 minutes to process that, so I can do my best. I think that on a statewide scale, we have an opportunity to influence all of the the core work of the networks and to help self-identify with the Minnesota Food Charter and the collective work that we're doing across those 99 strategies of the Food Charter. And so when you bring 99 strategies together, I think then that gets called a movement rather than focusing on a few strategies within those through a network. We're focusing on all of them across the entire state, and I think that really facilitates what could be considered a movement.
I want to remind people that if you have questions, you can use the Q&A app inside the Hangout, or you can tweet them using the hashtag EXTCAN. And I want to thank the U of M Extension Health and Nutrition Twitter account. Whoever's running that is playing us up and giving a play-by-play and sharing some great resources, including some of the books that, or the book that Jeff mentioned. I love that phrase, the smartest person in the room is the room. How challenging is that concept to maybe not just extension professionals individually, but to state extension organizations who maybe are just used to the traditional direct education approach? Jeff, I'm going to pick on you. You're nodding.
Well, yeah, I think it's an existential dilemma in some ways, because it sort of flips things on its head. If we're all experts, the emperor has no clothes, right? So we've had this sort of dissemination model where our position has been based on an authority, and if that authority is distributed, our authority looks very different. And I would argue that it's increasingly based on connectivity. I just wanted to loop back on this regional structure. I think that there's a danger, sometimes these things are done for economic reasons, and it just results in consolidation and bottlenecks. But the term network weaver was mentioned, and I think that's just really critical. If we're going to make that pivot, that transition from a top-down knowledge dissemination model to a network model, we really have to invest in the people who have the skills to be the network weavers, the boundary spanners, the knowledge brokers, who can translate between audiences. And we also need the technical infrastructure and the technical skills to maintain those systems which allow information and trust to flow across these networks. And so I'm hoping that e-extension can play a role in helping us in extension and land-grant universities in general make that transition, because I think there's incredible opportunity for us.
Jeff, so just to build on what you just said, one of the ways that we've been thinking about our work, and really as a center within the Center for Family Development, which is where each of the three of us are housed, is really thinking about how we're all learners and we're all teachers, and we've had some professional development opportunities that have really challenged us, or at least me personally, I guess I'll speak for myself, have really challenged my own thinking about that, but also sort of unleashed the power of what is, and sort of when you go into a community, you see a very different, you look at that from a very asset-based approach, and you realize they have so much to offer. And so as an example, at our Extension Fall Conference, our leadership within the Center for Family Development brought in a woman named America Brock from the Latino Health Access out in California, and the Latino Health Access lives the model of that we all have skills and we're all teachers, and so that's been really fun, and they have some really core principles that powers in relationships and thus powers in communities. And I think, as Jeff said, that is a really, there's tension there when we think about the bureaucracy of what is academia and an extension.
All right, so we're not the smartest. Well, I think that's one of the great things about these conversations, and it's just a different way of doing it than I'm used to in say something like my podcast, where I'm asking all the questions and I'm in control, and now here we are in sort of a networked environment here. So you're making me think a little bit on my feet, and if we're not, if we're going away from this expert model, or we need to go away from this expert model, I believe we do. Or at least have less stress on it, especially when it comes to these complex issues that can't be addressed that way. Then what are the roles for extension professionals in these spaces? And some of them have come up. Jamie spoke to sort of the things that she's doing, and we've heard the term network weaver and those kinds of things. But what are some of the ways that extension professionals can be involved in this work within the network space?
I'd love to hear what Jeff has to say, because I'm pretty sure I was following Jeff when he was talking about, or I think this is your work, about this concept of knowledge networks, and you were talking about knowledge brokers. And it is sometimes about the framing and the language that we use that's so powerful. And when I started reading more about that, I was like, oh gosh, this fits into the extension frame really well, and I felt really excited about that. So I think, Jeff, that's your part of your work, right?
Yeah, and I'm sort of the agitator too, because I think that extension can not only do good sort of downstream in the communities, but it can push back against these research institutions and saying, we have knowledge and wisdom on the ground that needs to come up. And Scott Peters here at Cornell has really been a leading voice for land grants as people's colleges, where the doors swing both ways. And I think that there's a role for extension in supporting healthy networks in a way that sort of allows information to flow up to our institutions so that the researchers are doing research that's relevant. But I also don't think that we should get away from extension as a way of bringing evidence and research-based knowledge into these conversations that we're having at a community, because the danger, and sort of the other part of David Weinberger's phrase of we need to build smart networks, the other half of that sentence is, because if we do it badly, it makes us distressingly dumber, right? And so extension can actually bring evidence base into these conversations and prevent people from being caught in their own echo chambers, whether it's against vaccinations or all sorts of things where bad information gets disseminated through networks as well. So I think extension really can be that middle ground of helping keep the conversation focused on true learning.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's so when I talked about at the beginning, I've been involved in the Farm to School leadership team in Minnesota. And in 2014, we pulled together not only our team of 11 organizations, but about 13 other organizations to develop a policy platform for advancing farm to school in Minnesota. And I served in this role, and our dean of extension here, I kept everyone informed along the way, because of course when you engage in policy, you do have to really think about what is your role. And my role was always to create safe spaces and to share the evidence base that was out there, and to ensure that we were developing a policy platform that truly addressed both the needs and sort of was grounded in something more than I think this is a good idea. And so I think, and to Jamie's point too, she was talking about, as this work emerges, there's so much scholarly opportunity here. And that is one of the things that we can be counted on as extension professionals, is providing that neutral space and environment, but also ensuring that we're leveraging the research base of our academic institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Jamie, I think those are great roles for extension educators to play. It occurs to me that maybe our tendency, because of our traditional role, might be to start playing those like right now. I'm going to throw together a network this afternoon. How can extension professionals sort of ease into this?
Yeah, don't just like start a network. That's unless you've done the work, the good work that it takes to start a network. Don't just start one, because it's a big deal. It's a lot of work to do it well. I would say start participating in networks and just start feeling that vibe, that energy that you get when you're participating in the networks, and start feeling the power that can get generated, and get excited about working at a network on the network level. Do some research about it if you get excited about it, and move from there. But I think just like we talk about doing genuine and authentic community engagement when we're talking about the traditional extension educator model, I think you need to do the same when you're working at this level. Get to know the networks, get to know the people behind them, and figure out how you can support them and help move the work forward.
Noelle, I just think that's really important message. I think it's if we really talk about almost anything in extension, in my experience, okay, well, let's build that, or there's a need for this content type, well, let's build it, and not looking at what exists already.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of go-getters that work for this organization, and that is not a bad thing. But something that I found in my experience with networks is kind of holding back and making sure that you are starting something that is really community-driven, and we're not coming in with our own agenda, even though that's hard, and there are certain things that we as health and nutrition educators need to make sure that we're intentionally bringing into the network, things like healthy food access or the perspective of equity. But I think doing that in a way where you're meeting the communities where they are at and enabling this more grassroots framing of the issue and how we're going to approach it, and balancing that can be tricky, but I think taking the time to slowly build the relationships and having the right people a part of your network who share the same kind of philosophy that, this is something that we're going to do together. And even though, self-interest is not necessarily a bad thing in a network, it's, what keeps people coming to the meetings and actively engaged and wanting to do the work in between the meetings. But I think kind of figuring out how to balance all of those things and really coming in at the beginning. I just recently started working with a new network, and it was kind of formed by people similar to me who have more of a facilitation role, thinking that they were going to pull together this group to apply for this specific grant to work on a specific aspect of food processing. And the reality is, when we pulled the group together, we started having a much different conversation about marketing the food and developing the infrastructure and coming together over regional distribution models. And now applying for that grant isn't even on the table anymore, but we have 4 different kind of action teams forming that are working on different pieces of it, where there was a lot of momentum, and where we were able to keep the people who were in the room for the first meeting to come back to the second meeting, and also bring others on board with them.
I really think that there's all kinds of important stuff there in what Noelle said, and it occurs to me that maybe that's one thing that I don't know if we've addressed enough, and that is the emergent nature of working in these networks, and that's why they can be so effective at addressing complex issues, because those are emergent as well. We don't know where we're going, and we can't map it out, and I think that leads to the natural question, especially inside of extension, about we're used to mapping things out, right? That's why we have the logic model. So, right. So we're going to figure out what the outcomes are over here, and then we're going to draw a path and go directly there. Can you talk about that a little bit, Jeff, in terms of how this might affect sort of a traditional approach to extension planning, and we can merge into this evaluation question too, which I think is really important. And Jeff, you're there. We go. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think that that's a really, that could be a whole session in itself right there, the challenges of doing this work. And I think one of the challenges is that most of us are on this grant cycle, that we have to sort of define what it is we're going to accomplish before we accomplish it. And network weaving is much more organic. Like we just heard, you're not even sure where it's going to go. So one of the things that I would suggest, and this is what we had with the Northeast Food Knowledge Ecosystem Project, is find a funder who's willing to take that chance with you, to go where the network wants to go. The other issue is that those of us who are closer to academia are on the semester system. And so a lot of times you'll get students or a class involved in a project, and really they're often taking more from the community than giving it. They're going in and they want the community to show up and offer their insights, but they get very little in the end. So part of the problem is our business model, and be very careful if you're building a network that it's built on the right funding structures and the right management structures that allows it to go where it needs to go. The other thing, and this is sort of pivoting towards that evaluation component, there's a group here, the Cornell Office for Research on Evaluation, that's developing networked pathways, or taking logic models and actually linking them together, stacking them, so you can have multiple projects working in parallel and intersecting at various points. And they have a free tool called the Netway, so anyone now can actually sign up and get a free account. If you just search Netway Core, you'll get the URL. I don't have it now, but I've been playing around with that and entering logic models and exploring others, and it's a great tool. I think we could perhaps pull them in to do an e-extension webinar and show how those of us who are struggling to document need and impact in a networked way, we really need the right tools and the right metrics to do that.
I want to underscore what Jeff just said too about having funders at the table. When we conducted 15 interviews of statewide networks across the country, and one of the things that came up that was really clear was that it was so important to have funders at the networked table with you, so they understood the evolving and emergent work that occurs and the power of that. And so I think there's something there. And then also, I was just involved in a conversation where with the Minnesota Food Charter Network, we brought in some of our evaluation colleagues to talk about how do we begin to really evaluate the impact of this statewide network. And our own evaluator, Mary Marchek, said, you know, can we really use a logic model? You know, this work is so developmental, and she really does take a developmental approach, which is fabulous for us because she's open to the emerging and evolving sort of change. But I do think taking a developmental approach, a systems lens, appreciative inquiry are all really important as we think about how to evaluate this work. And when we were interviewing other states, one of the things that we learned is that Iowa has done a very good job in thinking through how they evaluate the work of their regional food system working groups. And the Leopold Center out of Iowa and has sort of led some of that work, and we're fortunate to be contracting with Corey Bregendahl and her team in Minnesota so she can share some of their experience with us and build our own internal capacity within Extension actually to do this type of evaluation work. So that's something that's happening in 2016 that I'm really excited about, is us as educators building our internal capacity to do this type of evaluation.
I wanted to just build on that too. I wrote down some words, messy, intuitive, and adaptability instead of control. I think that these are qualities that you need to have when you're working at the network level, and that not everyone has these qualities. There's different types of people that do good, great work in different types of ways. And if that's not the way you work, if you're not okay with a mess and sort of leaning into the gray, then there's still a place for you at the table in a network, but it's probably not facilitating a network. But I think that as extension educators and people from extension, you can find your role, whether it's, evaluation, keeping it more like eye on the prize, or if you're working on action teams or working groups where you have a focus and you can take concrete steps to achieve an outcome and follow a logic model along the way. I think there's a place for everyone, but I just wanted to emphasize that it is super messy, really intuitive, kind of new and emerging work to be leading or facilitating a network.
So have any of you felt that pressure? I guess here in North Dakota it would be, where's your impact report, or that kind of thing. And you say, how do you say? It's somewhere in the future. It's somewhere, 6 or 12 or 24 months down the road. Have you felt that tension?
Yeah, I can speak to that as we're sort of going through growing pains in the network that I facilitate right now. And like I said, we have funders that are at the leadership team table that totally think like a network, and they sort of embrace the network model. But their supervisors aren't necessarily on that same page, and so they're saying, where are the tangible outcomes? Are we increasing fruit and vegetable intake as a result of this network in our community? And it's, as a network, it's really hard to show those types of details, but like Steph said, we're very fortunate to be collaborating with Corey Bregendahl and her team with the Leopold Center, and so we're working on pulling together some evaluation tools that focus on tangible outcomes, that focus on connections that were made and what those connections lead to, funding that's been leveraged as a result of the network, learnings that have taken place and what those learnings have resulted in, and that's not easy. That's not easy work, and so I'm hoping that we'll be able to share those resources and help others be able to do their work more efficiently.
I would just add, I think, so this recent conversation that I had around evaluating the statewide network, we had evaluators around the table saying network evaluation is developmental and emergent in our field. And so we're, so just to sort of recognize the infancy, if you will, of network evaluation is something that our network colleague or our evaluator colleagues wanted us to sort of know. But they also, they talked about network. One of the things that was sort of new to me was this concept of a network life cycle, and also the 3 pillars of network evaluation being around connectivity, and then vibrancy, and then impact, and that there are certain metrics and measures and outcomes from each of those different connectivity, vibrancy, and impact that you can look for. So I think, I don't think Jamie is saying ultimately we do want residents of the metro area eating more fresh fruits and vegetables and eating more healthfully, but that is more sort of impact 5 years, 10 years down the road, and what are the impacts and outcomes that we're looking at in years 0 through 3 that show us or are an indicator to us that we're on the right trajectory. And so I think that's constantly evolving and changing, and the ability to articulate impact also, I think, is strengthened when we talk about storytelling. And so I think there's something about that too when we can talk about change in community, real change that makes some of this, we're working on complex issues here. These are going to take a while. We didn't become an obese nation, as an example, overnight. It took generations, and so it's going to take time to really make an impact. But I think storytelling can also be a really powerful mechanism for evaluation.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think that storytelling piece and recognizing the successes even early in the development of a network is really important for funders and for those of us working for organizations to build networks and ultimately being accountable to our organizations and an annual review or whatever. But I think really capturing those stories and developing the narrative is really important for the life of the network itself and for the members of the network, and to keep people coming back to those meetings. During our interviews that Stephanie referenced with the network leaders in other states, we heard that people really in this very busy day and age have limited patience for meetings that don't have tangible things coming out of them. So I think for people leading the networks, to recognize that and to take care to celebrate every success that you have, no matter how small it may seem. Maybe it's one relationship that's cultivated within the network, and that leads to some other type of collaboration or project that, maybe it's not even central to the work of the network, but it's something that happens through that development and through those relationships that are formed. And taking the time to acknowledge those things and lift them up is really critical for the longevity and just the strength of networks.
I want to go, as we're running down on time here, a little bit more, maybe a little bit more granular, and I just feel like that part of this is developing a network mindset among extension professionals. Whether that is ever implemented in sort of the broad collective action networks that we're talking about today, we in network literacy, we believe it's important just for being an active learner in today's world and sort of being part of the culture. And so I want to go to sort of that idea and how that might play into preparing people for networked, for working within these collective action networks. First of all, do you agree with that premise? Do you have to sort of have a personal network mindset in order to be effective in these networks? Jamie's shaking her head no, so open your mic and tell and explain why.
I guess I'm just thinking about the last comment I made. Like, I don't think that everyone can. I don't think everyone's going to excel at thinking like a network, and especially not the great folks that we've attracted to Extension because they're awesome educators. I think that there's definitely a way that can happen for a lot of people, but for some people, they are really good at what they were hired to do. And like I said, I think their role is more like you also said, granular. So focusing on the work of the action teams or the work groups or the actual action that's taking place, so they can follow sort of a logic model or more concrete steps with objectives and outcomes and really strong evaluation measures to focus more on the traditional type of work that they're doing.
I think too, building on what Jamie just said, I think the recognition that this work is developmental is really important. So, I think I totally agree with what Jamie is saying. I mean, you can't, as an individual, you can't have skills and competencies in every single area. We have natural inclinations as individuals to work in certain ways. And I don't think that should be labeled as, good or bad. It is. And so, but I do think that the work is developmental. And so here's just one example. I was listening to our Commissioner of Health speak at a national conference, and he was on a panel discussion, and one of his panelists out in Tennessee said, well, we're not Minnesota, we just can't work in that way. And he was speaking specifically to the Department of Health's report on advancing health equity that addressed structural racism in the report. And the commissioner, our Department of Health commissioner, stopped him right there and said, no, we've been working hard at this for a number of years, you can too. And so I guess I hesitate to say I guess my point is I hesitate to say that if you don't have it now, you never will. Like, this is capacity building over time. And I also think there's a different way of framing. A colleague of ours, Maggie Adamak, who has provided a lot of support and development of the food charter, thinks about meeting design as curriculum. And she thinks about agenda items as lesson plans. And so if you want to, kind of get back to thinking about extensions, traditional ways of working and thinking, I really do think you can think about network development and bringing people together and even designing a meeting as curriculum and thinking about the agenda items that get people engaging with each other as lesson plans. So I think there are out-of-the-box ways to think about the work that we do in Extension as educators, if that makes any sense, hopefully.
Seth, I think that also points to the fact of just even if this isn't your wheelhouse, recognizing that it is important. One isn't labeled good and one isn't labeled bad, that we're all seeing ourselves as benefiting the whole for greater good. I think it also points to the fact that we can play a role in helping to educate our leaders to understand how to think on that holistic level as well.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here and say that I think people can be a part of networks, an important part, and not actually see themselves as in a network. And I think that once you start explaining it to people, it can become much more accessible. And they're like, oh, yeah, you're right. And even if they're not playing sort of a core central role as a boundary spanner or some connector, they might still be an important part of it. And I think we really do need to make an effort within Extension to at least talk about what networks are and their value, even if people aren't thinking about them every day, because it is a pretty profound way of acting. And if we're not aware of it, we could actually be doing damage in the work that we do. We can be building unhealthy dependencies, for instance, whereas a network can build interdependencies. And one of the ways that I've found success in telling that story, sort of getting back to stories, is I talk about soil health. Almost everybody has had a garden or knows what gardening is and how important it is to build the health of the soil before you have a good garden, and you're sort of building up its capacity. And I had a big breakthrough with our NEFTI project in talking about all the technology and the interconnections, the data connections and the technology. And somebody said, I'm having trouble wrapping my brain around it. And I said, well, it's kind of like mycorrhiza. Those network of those little fungal tendrils that go 80 to 90% of plants actually depend on them to get the nutrients that they need, including phosphorus, which is not absorbable. They can also transmit information from plant to plant. So one plant's getting attacked by an insect and it says, put your defenses up, And so that plant doesn't have to have their defenses up all the time. And so, when we start telling the story about networks like that in an accessible way, I think people come to it more than if you try to sort of educate them and use all of the jargon. And so that's what I think those of us who are sort of in the know need to work on our translational abilities.
I think that's, as we're running out of time, I think that's a great way to sort of wrap up this conversation. And I lost my camera, so I mean, you don't get to look at me anymore, so we might as well just throw the whole thing away. I want to thank you guys. This has been really great. I think I hope that those of us who are interested in networks kind of continue these conversations in the future. And I really want to thank you for your time. I want to mention that I'm doing this in my role as engagement coordinator of the E-Extension Network Literacy Community of Practice, so that means I get to put in my plug for the community of practice. And if you are interested at all in the role of networks inside of Cooperative Extension, follow the hashtag NetLit, so hashtag NETLIT, or go to extension.org and search for network literacy and join our community and continue to learn from folks. So Noelle, you came off mute, so I just want to see if there's anything you wanted to add at the end here.
I just wanted to say thank you for hosting a great conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, we'll stop our broadcast there. Thanks everybody for the questions and for following along with us. And of course, this will be available on the YouTube channel for e-extension network literacy. Please share it widely. I think a lot of folks in Extension can benefit from the conversation. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon.
Keep up the